Miss, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members have access to exciting opportunities through their involvement with the Institute. This includes volunteering for evening programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come see you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Gerges, the Deputy Director of the Department of Military History.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you, and thank you for coming out on such an interesting weather day in here. I have a real pleasure today to introduce both a friend and a mentor, as well as your speaker today. Rich Barbuto is a graduate of the United States Military Academy, served an Army career, was assigned to the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, then retired, got his Ph.D. Through Ted Wilson at KU, and became the Deputy Director of the Department of Military History, a position I now do, so I owe a lot to Rich. This is his fifth presentation at the Dole Institute. He's written 4 books on the War of 1812 and various aspects of it. But I think what's really going to be a treat is just how big his international and renown goes. When I was a relatively young scholar, went to a conference in England at the University of Southampton where all the papers of the Duke of Wellington are held. And one of the afternoons we went out to Stratfield, say, the Duke of Wellington's manor house. And I'm standing there waiting to get a tour of the Duke of Wellington's home, and I'm talking to some of the other scholars, and there was only 2 of us from North America, myself and a Canadian. So I introduced myself, and we're talking, and he asked me, "Where do you teach?" And I said, "Oh, the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College." And he suddenly looks at me and goes, "Do you know Rich Barbuto?" And I was like, "Yeah, I work for him." Such a reputation that here we are at Stratfield Say in England, with a Canadian who knows Rich and respects his work. So with no further ado, Rich Barbuto.
Mark, thank you so very much. Thank all of you for coming out here today. And I appreciate you all doing that. And because I appreciate you all so very much, we're going to start this lecture with a quiz, but it'll be an easy quiz. I want you to hark back to the days when you were in grade school or perhaps high school. So think back to those 12 years of education, 12 years for most of you, some maybe more than that. And during that 12-year span, raise your hand if the name Robert Fulton came up in any of your studies. Very good. Now, did the name Robert Fulton come up in connection with a steamboat? Raise your hand. A lot of hands, okay. Did the name Robert Fulton come up in association with a submarine? Raise your hand. Oh my. Did the name Robert Fulton come up in association with a canal or canal system? Raise your hand. Very good. Did the name Robert Fulton come up in relation to the world's first steam-powered warship? Come up in your studies? Okay, well, given the lack of show of hands of those last 3 questions, I think we know what we're going to be talking about today. Robert Fulton, born in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, prior to the American Revolution. His father dies when he's very young. The family is impoverished. He picks up a liking for painting. He's fairly good at it. He only has a grade school education. But at age 17, he goes to Philadelphia, does paintings of landscapes and portraiture, barely ekes out a living for himself and sends some money home to his mom. While he's there, his doctor diagnoses him with consumption. And in that day and age, consumption was essentially a death sentence. But his doctor tells him, you know, if you can manage to go to Europe, the climate there will be good for your consumption, perhaps prolong your life. And I'm thinking to myself, if I were Robert Fulton and someone told me to leave Pennsylvania and go to Great Britain for your health, I think I would have asked for a second opinion. Nonetheless, at age 21, Fulton goes to Britain with a handful of introductions. One of the introductions is to Benjamin West, who is a painter. Now, what Fulton's got going for himself, besides his brains, tall, he's over 6 foot tall, which in that day and age was a tall person, very good looking, and exceptionally charming. He makes friends very easily. And Benjamin West takes him into his home and introduces himself to a large number of both American emigres and Brits. And he meets 2 lords who have more money than they know what to do with, but who are also very scientifically and engineer-minded. So they would have discussions ranging on a lot of areas, not necessarily painting. Now, he's also introduced to people who are doctors and chemists and engineers and scientists and any number of realms of study. And Fulton can participate in all these discussions. And people are fairly impressed with him. And he gets a number of supporters who are going to support him financially. But he changes his direction, as geniuses often do, to a different area than painting, and he moves to canals. So what you see here at the top line is a timeline of Robert Fulton's fairly short life. The white area there is the 20 years or so he spends in the United States. He spends 20 years in Europe after that. The red is the time he spends in Britain. The blue is when he goes to France. The red is when he returns to Britain. And after 20 years in Europe, he returns to the United States, and he dies in 1815. The names at the top of that timeline are the names of the primary naval vessels that he built. One of them is a submarine, and the other 3 are steamboats. Now, canals are important, and there's a rage on canals in Europe at the time. Transportation is 10 times less expensive than transportation by road. Cities are growing. You have to feed people in the cities. So the produce that comes from the countryside moves to the city to feed the people. Well, it's a lot easier to do it by a sail-powered boat than it is to carry it in a wagon where your half of your payload is fuel for the horse or the oxen that's drawing the wagon, besides taking longer. But if you can connect the rivers by canals, you can multiply the area where the farmers are growing the food and make it much easier, cheaper to move that food to the cities. Now, Fulton dives into this with a mechanical mind. He's going to write a book about it. Now, the big problem with canals is the water in the canal has to remain level, of course. And how do you then move over differences in terrain? Fulton knows all about locks. He designs locks and how the doors will open and the water will enter. But he also comes up with the idea that you see on the screen here. He puts wheels on the canal boats. The canal takes it to the base of an incline. There's a mechanism up top of gears and windlasses and pulleys. You connect the canal boat with a cable, and the mechanical advantage is so great that a couple horses or mules at the top of the hill can pull the canal barge up to the top and drop it into the next canal. This book he has covers everything you need to know about building a canal. It's really quite complete. You know, you could joke that all you need is the book and a shovel and you could go out and become an entrepreneur yourself. And so the book is very popular. He gets some money to produce the book by his friends, his supporters, his financiers, who give him the money. He publishes the book, sends a copy to the British ministry, sends a copy to Napoleon, sends copies to George Washington, and the governor of Pennsylvania, and one copy finds its way to Thomas Jefferson's desk. So he's building canals, but he never gets hired on as the chief engineer of a canal company. The book is successful, but at some point you run out of income from the book. It's patented, his ideas are patented in Britain, but not in mainland Europe. So he ostensibly is going to travel to France to get his book copyrighted and his mechanisms patented there so he can derive more income from his invention. And when he gets to France, he changes his bent entirely, drops the ideas of canals, and switches to submarines. David Bushnell builds a workable submarine during the American Revolution. Not entirely successful. So working on Bushnell's ideas, what Fulton comes up is his submarine, which he names the Nautilus. So you've heard of America's first nuclear submarine named the Nautilus. Jules Verne's submarine in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is named the Nautilus. It comes from Robert Fulton's submarine that you see here. Now this is a mock-up, a full-scale mock-up that's in a museum in Normandy. Let's talk about this sub for a little while. 4-man crew, 3 people are turning hand cranks that spin the propeller. The man up front is the commander. He can work both the rudder at the rear of the submarine. He also has a rotating cupola that you see there where he can see where he's going when he's above surface and below surface as well. He can actually use a hand crank and pop up that sail when they're above surface so that those 3 men with the hand cranks can take a break, I guess. He also runs the mechanism that attaches a mine, an explosive device, to the bottom of an enemy warship and then arms the mine, sets the fuse, and then tries to make his escape. So this 4-man crew can do it all. Now, the French government pays for this. The Minister of the Navy is looking forward to all of his ideas. And he talks about mines and torpedoes and other mechanisms that won't be built in France, they'll be built later. In a trial, now this submarine is being built in Paris on the Seine River. In a trial, he drops the submarine 25 feet, so it's resting on the bottom, and he has the 4-man crew stay there for 4 hours. Now, one of the reasons he can do this is, well, first of all, in that submarine, there's no light. There's no light coming into it. It's all but pitch dark. So he needs light. He's going to put candles and lanterns. Candles burn oxygen. People burn oxygen. He gets a chemist to produce oxygen, compress it, put it in a canister, put a valve on it, and he has several of these canisters in the submarine. So he can keep the lights on and the people alive for 4 hours submerged. And this is really quite the accomplishment. So now he's got a submarine that is practical, and he can move it up and down the Seine. A little problem with navigation and turning when submerged when you're fighting against a current, but it can be done. Now, you ask yourself, why a submarine? Is it just because he has intellectual curiosity and he wants to build something that he can improve upon? Well, his biographers posit this. He's read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and it's an argument for free trade against the mercantile system which exists in Europe. The mercantile system is, if you're a major power, you grab colonies, North America, the Caribbean, the west coast of Africa, India. You grab colonies, and these provide 2 things. They provide gold and resources. They also provide markets for the things you're going to make. So if you're in the colony, you can't trade with any other colony. You could only trade with the mother country. You produce items there. They're sent by merchant marine to the mother country where if they're food, it's consumed. If it's rum, it's drunk. And if it's gold, it is spent. But if it's anything else, it's a real raw material like lumber or something like that. It's converted into something that will be sold in the mother country, but also sent back to the colony and sold there. And they tell the colony, you can't manufacture anything. Anything you get that's manufactured, it comes from the mother company. Well, if you heard what I just said, doesn't that sound like the American Revolution? You can only buy tea from us. You can only buy, you have to pay taxes on manufactured goods. Well, all the major countries of Europe are doing this. Spain, France, Britain, the Netherlands to a certain extent as well. Adam Smith says, no, free trade will give you peace. Because what the mother country has got to do is protect its trade route and its colonies with a very large navy. And they're escorting the convoys back and forth. So all the major countries have major navies. And when there's a war, it's not so much fighting between the mother countries. The fighting takes place in the colonies, as one country tries to steal the colonies of another to increase its wealth at the detriment of its enemy. So that's what's been going on in the 17th and 18th centuries. Adam Smith says that peace follows free trade. Fulton is thinking, well, if that's so, is there anything I could do to advance the idea? The submarine's it. If you can give a small country the ability to very economically take down a ship of the line, and you could do it where you cannot be attacked, it's pretty well, you can do this at will, and Fulton thinks you can, then all of a sudden navies get reduced in size and ultimately they become irrelevant. And so the economic system of Europe and North America and the rest of the world starts turning towards free trade as being a better idea than perhaps the mercantile system. Now, all this works out wonderfully in France until Napoleon changes the French naval minister. The new minister doesn't want anything to do with Fulton or his ideas. To him, it's not a help to the French Navy, it's actually working against the French Navy. So Fulton is getting a cold shoulder. His next ideas are being rejected. Britain, on the other hand, gets word of this submarine and what its potential is to take down the Royal Navy. They want it, and they don't want France to have it. So now France and Britain are at war. Britain sends a secret envoy, contacts Fulton, offers him a big pile of money, and Fulton does a couple things. He goes to Britain, but before he goes, he destroys the Nautilus, and he grabs all of his papers and plans for the Nautilus, and he takes them with him to Britain. And here's what he builds in Britain. These are some of his ideas. In the upper left-hand corner, you've got a rowboat. The Royal Navy called it a cutter. You have a number of oarsmen that can move it very quickly. And there's a fellow in the back, the pilot, who runs the rudder. And you've got a gunner up top. Now, the gunner's standing up. He's got one hand on a spar and one hand on a lanyard. The spar goes through a pivot point at the front of the cutter, and it continues on. And at the tip of the spar is what is called in those days a torpedo. This is not the torpedo of today. It's not self-propelled, all right? It's really a mine. It's an explosive device. And the concept here is to take the cutter, get it as close to an enemy ship as possible, at the last moment drop the spar so that the explosive device is touching the hull of the vessel under the surface of the water. And then the gunner pulls the lanyard to explode the torpedo, and then all the members of the cutter swim for their lives because of the explosion that followed. This concept works. It works in the American Civil War, where a Navy crew that is on a cutter pretty much like this destroys a Confederate ironclad. So there's proof of principle here. This is a viable weapon system. To the right of that, you see a group of mines. These are floating mines. Well, how do you get 120 pounds of explosive device in a copper-covered barrel to float? Well, you fill it up with cork. So Fulton builds a mine that floats. It's anchored to the bottom of a harbor or a river. It's set at about 12 feet below the surface of the water. So small vessels that are civilian vessels, schooners and sloops, just sail right over the top of it. If you're a ship of the line, you're drawing more than 12 feet. So you are going to be below that 12-foot line, and you're going to hit one of the triggers at the top of the mine. And when you do that, you're going to have a nasty explosion underneath you, which presumably would sink a vessel. Now, what do you do when the target is moving? Well, the mine is one way, but you can't get the mine there during a battle. You have to do it in advance. What you can do is the harpoon gun that you see there on the left. This is ingenious. Hardly works, but it's ingenious. So you have the cutter. You're tracking a moving target. When you get close to it, you fire the harpoon. It sticks into the side of the target vessel. It's connected by a cable to the floating mine, so the crew kick it out of the cutter, and it will travel towards the harpoon, towards the ship. And there's actually a line that runs from the cutter through a loop in the harpoon back to the mine, so you could actually close the distance between the mine and the harpoon. And at the last minute, you pull the small cord there, which is the lanyard, and you explode the mine when it's alongside the target ship. All right. The bottom one is the one that turns out to be perhaps most successful. This is a top-down view of an enemy ship, and the line that you see that is in the front of the ship, the prow, represents the anchor cable. So if you have an enemy ship, it's at anchor in a harbor at night. You can attack it this way. What you have is two floating mines with 100 feet of cable between them. And we're going to talk about the Battle of Boulogne, where this is actually put together. 3 Royal Navy cutters with 20 of these floating mines slips into the harbor at Boulogne. There's a whole squadron of French warships anchored there. The tide is rising. It's coming into the harbor, so there's a gentle current from the English Channel into the harbor. You get as close as you can at night. You very silently put these mines into the water. They drift, the 100 feet or so apart, and they start moving towards the targets. And you're hoping that they get caught on the anchor cables, because once they do, then the mines are going to start continuing to moving toward shore, will swing around and bump up against the sides of the target. And these are on a timed mechanism. This is ingenious. He takes a clock spring, and he'll set it for 15 minutes in this case. And it drives a disc. There's a disc very slowly rotating. Well, the disc isn't perfectly round. There's a gash in the disc. And after 15 minutes, the gash will line up. Now, riding this is the trigger of a flintlock mechanism. The flintlock you see on a flintlock musket, all right? So after 15 minutes, the spring that drives the trigger hits the gap, pops the trigger, it hits forces the hammer down, scrapes the flint against the iron frizzen, causes a spark, and 120 pounds of gunpowder goes up right at the surface of the water. Okay. In this attack, not all 20 mines explode. So the clockwork isn't perfect. But and all the Royal Navy sailors on these 3 cutters, they all escape with their lives. And stay dry, too. The French commander the next day reports that one of his warships has been sunk. Royal Navy's real happy with this result. This is a proof of principle. They can continue doing this. So 13 days after this, what Fulton does for the Royal Navy buys a decrepit frigate, anchors it, and now this is in daylight so everybody can see what's happening, and Fulton demonstrates how this floating mine system works, and it blows up the Dorothea. I mean, a huge explosion, big spray of water. The Dorothea breaks in half and sinks. So the Royal Navy is real pleased to see this. Now, this is all well and good until Admiral Nelson at Trafalgar destroys the French and the Spanish fleets. All of a sudden, the Royal Navy doesn't need Fulton anymore because they've got the balance of naval power and they'll have it till the end of the war. Okay, so basically they pay Fulton off for his expenses and a little bit extra and hope he goes away. Fulton does go away, and he goes away angry. But he, at this point here, he returns to the United States. He goes to New York City. He's going to do two things. He's going to prepare for the defense of New York City, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But this is what he does for the civilian world. There's a lot of traffic that travels up and down the Hudson River. Now, people didn't call it the Hudson River in those days. They called it the North River, and that's the name of the river since the Dutch were there in Manhattan. So the North River. Fulton calls this passenger steamboat the North River Steamboat, or just the Steamboat. But his partner, who comes up with all the money, is Robert Livingston, one of the wealthiest men in New York. He owns an estate on the Hudson. Most of the people in New York live between New York City and Albany, 150 miles away, along the Hudson River. And there's a tremendous amount of traffic going back and forth. So Livingston gets naming rights, he paid for them, and so they call it the Claremont, which is the name of his estate on the Hudson River. So that's how the name of Claremont is associated with this very successful commercial steamboat. It carries passengers. Now you have a choice. You could take a sailboat from New York City to Albany. It'll take you 4 days. You're going to spend at least 3 nights sleeping on the sailboat. You may not move at all if the current and the wind are going, well, the current's always heading south, but depending on the direction of the wind, you may not move at all. So this trip could take longer than 4 days. Or you could take the Claremont, the North River Steamboat, and do it in 32 hours, so you're only spending 1 night sleeping on board. It's a luxury liner. You can purchase a cabin with a bed. You could purchase a place to sit in a very comfortable couch on the inside aisleways, gourmet meals, a wine list that's comparable to anything you're going to find in a restaurant in New York. They serve ice cream. So people take this, commercial success. He buys his way into the history books. But he's got a couple other steamboats that he makes in New York City. There's a lot of traffic between New York City, which is at the lowest end of Manhattan, and Brooklyn across the East River. There's a lot of traffic between the bottom tip of New York City and Jersey City across the Hudson River in New Jersey. So he replaces, well, he doesn't replace, there are still sailing ferries going back and forth. He builds a steam ferry. It goes basically under where the Brooklyn Bridge is today, which is pretty much the narrowest spot on the East River. So he carries that traffic. He also he builds a roll-on, roll-off steamboat that covers the traffic with New Jersey. Now, what does this mean? Big steamboat, paddle in the middle. It's a catamaran design, 2 hulls basically. Pulls up to the dock in New Jersey. The teamster can drive his wagon and oxen or mules or horses directly onto the deck, and there's enough room for about 4 wagons, so it can carry easily 10 or 12 horses or mules, plus cargo, plus people. And then the paddle wheel will take it to New York, and the front of the boat looks exactly the same as the back of the boat, and you now roll off onto the dock in New York City. The pilot of the vessel flips a switch, and now on the steam engine, and now the paddle wheel goes in the opposite direction while they're loading on wagons heading to New Jersey, and immediately go set off for New Jersey, and the wagons there just roll directly off of it. So interesting concept in its day, makes tons of money. So when we say that Fulton builds the first commercially successful steamboat, he's building a bunch of them. A couple of years after he launches this steamboat, he builds one that is home ported in Pittsburgh, and it runs the Mississippi River in a steamboat down to New Orleans and back. carrying a lot. This one is mostly cargo, some passengers. So the first steamboat on the Mississippi, to be followed by hundreds more, is Fulton's New Orleans. Now let's talk about the naval warfare aspect of this. Fulton goes there. He's a patriotic American. He's approached by representatives of the Navy and the Army, and his good friend DeWitt Clinton, who's the mayor of New York City, to defend New York. This is what, this map of New York shows the three ways that the British can attack New York. Now, the British attacked New York City before. They did it during the Revolution. They occupied New York City for the duration of the war. Look at the red arrow there. Basically, the British landed over 20,000 soldiers on Staten Island, shuttled them to Long Island, across the Narrows. This is the point where the Verrazano Narrows Bridge exists today. The soldiers crossed into Long Island. They fought their battles on Brooklyn Heights, captured Brooklyn, and then shuttled the troops across the East River to land in Manhattan, where they occupied the city. While they were occupying the city, there were two major fires in New York, and before the war was over, 1/3 of the city of New York had been burned to the ground and had not been rebuilt during the course of the war. So the New Yorkers are much aware that their city is vulnerable. New York City is the largest city in the country. New York Harbor is perhaps the best harbor on the Atlantic coast. So they are highly vulnerable. Now, the other way the Royal Navy can attack is the Blue Arrow. This is where they just send the warships, the ships of the line and the frigates, straight through the Narrows, approach New York City, fire red-hot shot into the wooden buildings of New York City, and burn the city and the shipyards to the ground, and not one British person has to set foot on shore. The third way is the Green Arrow. This is coming through Long Island Sound, working your way to the point, it's called Hellgate, the point where the East River and the Harlem River and Long Island Sound all meet. You drop your troops off there, and they, on Manhattan, move south towards New York City. And for the American Army that's in New York City, there's no escape. So all of these three things have to be defended against. Let's see how it's done. So the black pentagons you see there are all major forts constructed out of stone that the American Army engineers, graduates of West Point, build from about 1807 on, right up to and through the end of the war. Two of these still exist. In the upper right-hand corner, what you have here is Castle Williams, named after the chief Army engineer. That building exists today on Governor's Island. If you're out in the harbor, you can sail right by it. It looks very much like what you see in this image here. Now, the other fort directly below that is Castle Clinton, named after DeWitt Clinton, who was the mayor at the time, right at the tip of Battery Park. You can still walk by there today. Now, what you see in greenery there did not exist 200 years ago. That was all water. What the engineers did is they built an artificial island jutting out into the bay, the upper bay. They had a wooden causeway that connected it to the city, and it gave it a really good field of fire all the way around. After the war, the New Yorkers filled it all in with stone, and they smoothed out the coastline of Manhattan so it looks like it does today. Now, after the war, when there's no longer any need for this fort, they renamed it to Castle Garden. It became the immigrant reception center in New York City, basically for almost the entire East Coast. This is before Ellis Island was built on Ellis Island, the immigration center there. And it has been renamed Castle Clinton, and if you're in Battery Park, you could walk around, walk inside and visit it. It's a national site. Now, while all this is going on, Fulton is also helping the U.S. Navy. He works with Commodore John Rogers, who's the highest-ranking naval officer in the Navy at that time. So that we're talking about 1810, a couple years before the war starts. And they're going to conduct experiments with all these weapon systems that we talked about just recently. The target ship is commanded by a man by the name of James Lawrence. Now, you might have a glimmer of recognition there. You don't perhaps remember his name, but you absolutely remember his last words. His dying words were, "Don't give up the ship." Now, that happened in 1813. This is 3 years prior to that, so he's still alive, working well. Okay, Fulton explains to Commodore Rogers, here's the weapon systems, here's what they can do, and then Rogers sets up the experiment. Rogers and James Lawrence never tell Fulton what their defense mechanisms are going to be. So it's a surprise to Fulton. What James Lawrence does is he surrounds his ship, the target ship, with netting. It's standoff 6 to 8 feet away from the sides of the ship, 360-degree coverage. It's held down with very heavy lead weights, so it's not a matter of going under and somehow lifting up the net. You're probably not strong enough to do that. So Fulton brings that torpedo cutter into the fray with the torpedo at the end of the spar and the guys rowing as fast as they can. Can't get through the netting. He cannot bring the torpedo close enough to the side of the ship where an explosion would definitely have sunk it. He tries using the harpoon gun. Harpoon does not clear it through the netting. In a separate experiment, he fires the harpoon to see if the concept is good, because Fulton if he had known what he had to penetrate, he would build cutters to get through the netting. He says, I can bring a gun that will fire a payload, a warhead of knife blades to cut my way through the netting if I had to, and then attack through that hole. The harpoon won't get through the netting. In a separate experiment, he has to get 15 feet away from the side of the ship before the harpoon will stick deep enough to where he can move a mine towards it. So Commodore Rogers says, you failed all the tests. Now, we're going to give you the floating mines. We know that works, because we've seen that work before. So the experiments are largely a failure, except for the very last one that everybody jumps on. The Navy, the Army, DeWitt Clinton, the mayor, the Congress. Congress pays $500,000 to build this ship. Fulton calls it the Demologus, the word of the people. The Navy calls it Fulton the first steam-powered warship. Looks like the Ark, doesn't it? Does not need those sails. The only time it needs the sails is if the steam engine fails them. It's going to carry 16 guns, fairly high off the water levels. 32-pounders will certainly damage anything that the Royal Navy can float towards them. It'll make 5 knots. Doesn't need any wind. Regardless of the way the wind's blowing, this steamboat can move all around the harbor. It can move up the East River to Hellgate if it needs to. The outer walls of this are 5-foot thick oak. The Royal Navy could fire all day long at that thing and its old Ironsides. Now, the other diagram you see there in the upper right-hand corner is looking down the longitude of the Demologus. It's a catamaran. 2 separate hulls connected above the water line. The paddle wheel is situated between these 2 hulls. The only way the Royal Navy guns can touch this paddle wheel if they're perfectly lined up, shooting straight down the front or the back of the vessel. So the paddle wheel is pretty well protected. Here is a model of what the Demologus would look like. You see the paddle in the center. The steam boilers, represented by the 4 smokestacks there, are way down at the bottom of one hull to make sure that this vessel is not top heavy with all the heavy cannons aboard. And the steam is pumped across to the other side where the steam engine is located, driving a piston back and forth. The piston is connected to a flywheel which spins, so you're now converting linear power into rotary power, and that's what spins the paddle wheeler. And if you need to reverse the direction, it's just a matter of flipping a lever. So that's the Demologus. It has the The Demologus is launched in October of 1814. The British have burned Washington in August 1814. In September of 1814, they attacked Baltimore, the third largest city in the United States. They're stopped at Fort McKinley. They can't get past it. So the people in New York are expecting the Royal Navy to show up real soon, November or early spring. That's what the expectation is. The Demologus is launched in October, and it works wonderfully. The only problem is those guns haven't showed up yet. All the guns are being forged in Philadelphia. Those guns don't show up until January of 1815. In February of 1815, a couple things happen. One of them is word of the end of the war arrives in New York City. The peace treaty was signed on Christmas Eve in 1814. So New York is, whew, we dodged that bullet. The Royal Navy is not going to attack us. The Navy gets the guns, mounts them on the Demologus. The Demologus patrols New York Upper Bay for the next dozen years until an explosion in the magazine blows a hole in one side of the Demologus and it sinks, where it remains today at the bottom of New York Bay. So, how is Fulton remembered today? Well, you can see there's a bunch of counties and a bunch of cities. Fulton County comes to mind. That's in the news from time to time. There's a lot of Fultonvilles. The U.S. Postal Service has issued 2 stamps commemorating the Claremont and Robert Fulton. That stamp is, 60 years old now. We used to mail letters for 5 cents. Yeah, wow. Now, in the upper right-hand corner, you see Fulton's Crab Shop. This was, for 20 years, it was the seafood restaurant on a Disney property in Orlando. In 2016, they renovated, it was 20 years old, they renovated it, but when they reopened it, they took Fulton's name off. So it's still a seafood restaurant, but Fulton has disappeared. Now, you also see the cover of a British spy novel. There's 4 in this series. It's set in London in 1812, wrong year, but 1812, where Robert Fulton is working with the Royal Navy with all of his great ideas for submarines and mines and torpedoes. Britain is at war with France. Napoleon sends a spy network to operate in London, and the hero of this series is a guy by the name of Hawkwood. He's the 007 in this novel. So he and his partners slowly dismantled this spy ring, but Fulton is one of the characters in this novel. That's the only place I've seen Fulton in a novel in the 20th or 21st century. There was a black and white movie about Fulton building the Claremont, so that's ancient, but you can still find that. So that's pretty much how Fulton is remembered in the popular culture. So what do we have to say about Fulton? Well, many of his inventions are going to appear in the American Civil War. That torpedo boat is used by the U.S. Navy. It destroys a Confederate ironclad in North Carolina. Some of the crew will survive on the Navy side, not the Confederate side. So the mines are used during the Civil War. So his inventions stick. He's done the proof of principle. They're rebuilt by other countries. Other countries follow suit, and they build their steam-powered warships as well. So Fulton is an American genius. He's able to move all of his numerous concepts from the drawing board to practical inventions that are being used. He's got a wide array areas of expertise besides just painting. I say just painting. Besides an artist who paints pictures, he also works in other areas that were highly successful. So now, having said all of that, I open this presentation up for your questions. Please wait for there we are. Tom, make it easy.
First of all, I enjoyed your presentation very much. You described how the Demologus, the dreaded Demologus, is on the water, not only built, but on the water patrolling for 12 years in New York Harbor. The question is whether the submarine, the Nautilus, was ever actually used in a combat situation or in a patrol situation.
Gotcha. The Nautilus itself is not, but Tom, thank you very much for your models. I want to draw your attention. We've got two models of submarines. One of them is are both steam powered? One is steam powered.
One's crank.
And one's crank.
And one's steam powered.
Yeah, I suggest all you go see it. This is Civil War era, where there is the torpedo at the end of the spar. This is a contact fuse. This is not somebody pulling a lanyard. So that's the major improvement. The Nautilus does not. The Civil War, yes, we have submarines that actually go into combat and actually sink enemy vessels. Abel, please.
Yeah, thanks. So a lot of what you described with Fulton, I think we see early versions of during the Great Siege of Gibraltar, where these British engineers are kind of, they're surrounded. There's 160,000 Spanish and French troops, the largest battle of the American Independence War. There's like 5,000 British defending Gibraltar, and they're coming up with all this stuff. Floating mines, torpedoes, fire ships. It's kind of a hybrid of the old, Mediterranean-style fighting with newer, kind of the Fulton-type industrial naval warfare. So did he read about that? Was he inspired by that, or was that just kind of parallel evolution?
I think it's a parallel design. I think nothing Fulton has done is totally new. I suspect where he gets his ideas, I can't answer that question. Thank you, though. Sir, you have a question.
Could you talk about what happened after this? Did he die well respected or destitute, or what happened after?
That's a great question. So the war's over in February. New Yorkers discovered that the war is over in February of 1815. A few days after that, Robert Fulton and a friend are walking across the ice from Manhattan to New Jersey shore. His friend falls through the ice. Fulton drags his friend out. They're soaked in water. They make it to New Jersey. Fulton develops pneumonia, and he's dead 5 days later. Leaves a wife and 4 children. They're eventually taken care of by the New York Assembly. Will help the family out, but that takes a few years before that happens. He's a hero in New York City. He's mourned by the city, a state funeral. I mean everything. They pull out all the stops because the people of New York recognize what he gave to the defense of the city, even though the British didn't attack it. And they really like the Claremont. So, good question. Thank you. Okay, I think we've run out of questions. Thank you all very much for your attention. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.